So the question I'm asking is whether rail transit stations encourage neighborhood retail. And just to get a sense of how sort of familiar you guys are, how many of you ride public transit in Los Angeles? See, and people say LA Angelinos don't ride transit. How many of you ride buses? How many of you ride rail? Light rail or heavy rail? Okay, so good mix of both. Okay, so if I were to ask those of you who ride some of the rail lines in Los Angeles, whether you think there has been growth in economic activity, and specifically thinking about things like retail and food service and entertainment, whether you think there's more of that around rail stations than there was before the stations opened, what would you say? How many of you think that there's more economic activity around the rail stations than there would have been otherwise? How many of you think there's not a whole lot going on around rail stations? So mixed response, and you're sort of both right. It turns out in some places there has been growth, and in other places there hasn't. So it depends entirely which stations you're looking at and which cities you're looking at. So for those of you who are not transit riders and need convincing that this is in fact relevant for Los Angeles and for California, this shows you across the 4 major metropolitan areas in the state, the rail line systems and the number of stations that have been built and when they've been built. And the reason I'm breaking things pre-1992 and post-1992 is that's when my data on employment starts. So that's going to be sort of the division for me between new and old. But you can see within Los Angeles, we've got 2 different systems under LA Metro. Most of these are rail, a combination of heavy rail, like the red line, the purple line, and then lots of light rail lines as well. We have some bus rapid transit, and then MetroLink, which is the kind of commuter rail system that goes out to Orange County and up to Ventura and out to Riverside and so forth. Most of the stations in Los Angeles have been built post-1992, so you can see they've been building like crazy. And this only goes up to 2009, so this actually doesn't even include the Expo line and doesn't include the new subway to the sea, right? So we've been building a lot of rail stations relatively recently and continuing to do this. Sacramento expanded their light rail station. San Diego expanded the trolley system, which is a sort of little red trolley, kind of a streetcar in downtown. They also have the coaster system, which is essentially a commuter rail that goes out to the suburbs as well. San Francisco, of course, has the most rail of any of our metropolitan areas and the oldest, right? So some of the Muni lines have been in more or less continuous existence for 100 years, right, running around downtown San Francisco. BART was built primarily in the 1970s, but with some expansions. You've gone to the airport, you've ridden BART in to get to downtown. Caltrain is the commuter rail line that runs essentially down the spine of the Bay Area. San Jose has a light rail system, which is sort of during both periods. And then the Altamount Commuter Express, which only has a handful of stations and goes eastwards from the Bay Area. And a number of these also overlap, of course, with Amtrak stations. So the sort of context for this is California has been building a lot of rail. We've been spending a lot of money building these rail stations. What's happened as a result of this?
Why do the total not add up?
Oh, so the new stations are new stations that were opened exclusively prior. The older stations were stations that were in existence. So these 2 numbers actually do add up. Some of these, so the Amtrak overlaps, and actually some of these can overlap as well, right? So there are stations that serve multiple systems. So the motivation for this, we've been spending all of this money building all kinds of rail stations. What happens? And obviously one of the goals of transit investment is just to move people from place to place, but many of the supporters of transit have also argued that this is an economic development strategy, that the areas around transit stations, if you think about sort of basic urban models, putting in a transit station makes a location more accessible, right? That should be capitalized into higher land values, and higher land values should translate into more development activity, higher density of development. And I put this in here a little bit to be provocative. So the higher density development should happen with land values going up. Whether or not it's mixed use and pedestrian friendly requires other things to happen as well. But many of the transit advocates will say, you know, you build a light rail station, instantly you have this pedestrian-oriented mixed-use development around it, right? And we'll see some pictures of whether or not that's actually true. So if this attracts additional businesses who want to benefit from being near the station, get additional pedestrian activity, people coming by, these locations should be particularly attractive to consumer-oriented activities. So retail stores, food service, entertainment, the kinds of things that really depend on people walking by on the sidewalk and saying, I'm going to go to a movie, I'm going to get a cup of coffee, I'm going to buy a newspaper, right? So these kinds of businesses ought to be attracted to the areas around new stations. So the question I'm going to ask is whether retail employment, and I include food service in my definition of retail, whether retail employment has increased around the newly opened stations in California, and whether the impact of the stations on employment varies depending on the MSAs, the location of the station within the metropolitan area, the characteristics of the underlying neighborhood, or the station itself. And so I'm going to start off by showing you a couple of pictures to give you a sense of what these look like if you're not familiar. So this is Union Station, and I'm guessing that most of you have been to Union Station in downtown LA, right? So this is one of our iconic older stations. It's on National Registry of Historic Places. It's on Amtrak's list of great American train stations. You've probably seen this one in movies, right? There are lots of famous scenes of people sort of, getting off the train in Los Angeles, and here they are. Really beautiful architecture. What's the neighborhood like around Union Station?
Olvera Street, Chinatown.
Okay, so Olvera Street, which is the historic heart of Los Angeles, lots of tourist activity, lots of restaurants and shops and so forth. Chinatown, all kinds of economic activity, really bustling, right? So when you get off of the station, so this is actually in the background, there's some new apartments that have been built. You've got all kinds of business activity. This really is quite a pedestrian-friendly, walkable area with a ton of stuff going on, right? So that's kind of what we have in mind with this sort of trans-oriented development, even though some of that preceded the rail lines that we're looking at now, right? But Union Station itself has been there in the hub of activity for a while, okay? So how many of you have been to Burbank? How many of you have been to the IKEA in Burbank? Right, this is the reason to go, right? So as sort of a little experiment, I took the Metro link from Union Station to Burbank, which is about a 15-minute ride or so. And when you get off, this is what the station looks like. And let me see if I can show you. And so the Burbank station is right along the 5, right? So if you've driven the 5 to go up to IKEA, you've gone past the Burbank station, so it runs essentially parallel to the freeway. When you get off, you're on the south side of the freeway, so you have to go up over a little pedestrian bridge to get to the north side. But you can just see over here, right, this is the AMC Theater. So this is actually, if you see on the map, there's the train station, there's the freeway. You go across the little pedestrian bridge and you get over here, and this is the Burbank Town Center, so big mall activity, right? Here's the IKEA over here. So it's by, Google Maps tells us that it's a mile walk from the station over to Burbank, right? So you've got retail activity not immediately adjacent, but this is walkable. And if you didn't have a car, you could in fact take Metrolink to Burbank and then do your shopping at the mall.
So you're going to show us, you're going to standardize your area
Yes.
around? Okay.
Yes. This is just illustrative. Yes.
Question, do you recall what day of the week you took those photos? Was that a Sunday?
This is Saturday.
A Saturday?
Yeah.
Because there's not a person in your photo. Not one.
No, there were in fact a handful of people on the train, although not a ton. But this was a Saturday afternoon, right? And the Metrolink is mostly commuter rail, so you get more activity Monday through Friday. Yeah, I was actually impressed that there were trains running on Saturday afternoon. This is Irvine. Have any of you been to Irvine? Well, Jen can tell us. So what's going on around the Irvine station?
Nothing.
That's pretty much about right. And I wish Marlon were here so I could beat up on the planners who live in Irvine. So this is the Irvine station. This is one of our newly built stations. It's a stop on both Metrolink and on Amtrak. And I will say that while I was taking pictures of the station, both a Metrolink and an Amtrak train went by. And this was on a Sunday, so there are in fact trains running there. But pretty much what's around the station is this. There are a bunch of really big parking garages. There are a bunch of really big surface parking lots. And you pretty much have to have a car to get to any kind of a street. And then you're on these giant arterial streets with not a store or a business or anything else in sight. Not terribly pedestrian friendly or mixed use. And this one is actually my favorite. So how many of you have been to Commerce? This is east of LA, heading out to City of Industry, right? So this is the Commerce Station on the Metrolink, and the reason you know that is there's a little blue sign that says Commerce Train Station. This is not, in fact, a Metrolink train. This is a freight train, right? So for all of you who are doing urban freight, right, this is a freight train. This is a pre-existing freight line that's been here for I don't know how long. Lots and lots of freight trains go by. When Metrolink added this service, they basically just said, you know what, we have to go through Commerce anyway, getting from Orange County to Union Station. We'll just stop here, we'll hang up a sign, and we'll call this a station. But that was all they did. So if you turn around, this is what the Commerce train station looks like. You've got the train tracks, you've got a bunch of parking lots, and these are industrial buildings here. And that's all you've got. So you can, turn 360 around and you see nothing but an industrial wasteland, right? So this does not look like plopping down a train station has generated high-density, mixed-use, walkable activity. All right, so I've given you probably a flavor for what we're gonna find, which is that the stations are really heterogeneous and the impacts are gonna vary a lot. And for anybody who's actually driven around and looked at the different kinds of stations, the idea that there's going to be one single impact of a train station on the surrounding neighborhood doesn't make any kind of sense, right? But it turns out this is not a question that has really been studied all that frequently in the literature, the sort of interaction between the station characteristics, the neighborhood characteristics, and then the resulting economic activity. So that's really the motivation. Lots and lots of literature, some of it written by Peter and Jen and Marlon and a bunch of other faculty here and a number of our students working on this, to figure out what the impact of train stations is on various kinds of outcomes. When you build a station, do you get an increase in transit ridership or just a shift in mode share? What happens to property values, housing development, housing density, population characteristics, and so forth? So most of this stuff has been either on the land values or on the residential and population side. So one of the contributions of this study is that I'm looking at employment activity and particularly the type of employment that should be responding to this. And that actually has not been studied terribly, in part because the data are fairly hard to come by. The empirical settings of some of the prior papers, these vary enormously. So LA has not been studied all that much, in part because our transit infrastructure is fairly new. San Francisco has been studied all over the place, Atlanta, Dallas, so a lot of different cities, different time periods, very different kinds of rail systems, so heavy line, light rail, et cetera. And so part of the problem is that the existing literature is mostly focused on a single city, and so the results are specific to that particular city, that type of rail, those types of neighborhoods, and so then it becomes very hard to generalize what would happen in multiple places. So one of the other contributions of this study is that I'm actually looking at 4 different large metropolitan areas that have different modes of transit and different existing development patterns. And within those cities, there are multiple rail stations. You can test for instance, commuter rail versus the sort of intra-city rail stations. So a lot of variation in the kinds of rail systems, both within and across MSAs. And I'm lucky because of the newness of our systems. For many of these stations, I can look at trends in employment before the station opened and after the station opened. I see a number of my students from 560, and so this is the kind of thing we talk about with difference and differences, right? So I've got areas where there was no station, they built a station, and you can see what happens before and after. And as I'm going to show you, I'm also constructing some control areas to set up a counterfactual, what would have happened in the absence of the station. All right, so that's the overview. A little bit more kind of systematic information on what the stations themselves look like and the variation across the MSAs. So the bottom line here shows you for all stations across all MSAs. You can see this is relatively new if you think about certainly East Coast cities. The stations are built about 1.5 miles away from the nearest station. So overall, these are not dense networks, right? So if you go to Boston or New York, you'll see subway stations every 1/4 mile or so, and so these are really dense networks. That's not true here, and largely because we've got a lot of these suburban commuter rail stations. They're spread out at some distance from the CBD, so these are not right in downtown areas. And if you look overall, About 40% of the stations have at least some designated parking, either a lot or a garage adjacent to it, which again tells you that these are meant in large part for people who drive to the station, park, and then ride to someplace else. About 40% of these were built in areas where the initial employment base around it was commercial, which would include both kind of retail, office uses, professional services, and so forth. But a pretty substantial share of these were built in places that were largely industrial. So if you think about the Commerce Station, these were built in places that had transit infrastructure, warehousing, industry of various kinds, which is not sort of obvious for where you would want to do a TOD. And then about a third of these were built near what I call public and institutional uses. So if you think, for instance, Civic Center in downtown LA, most of the employment activity nearby were government offices, right? Or near large hospitals, universities like USC. And again, this sort of thing should matter for the kind of development, because if you build a train station right next to, for instance, all of the civic buildings in downtown LA, the government owns a lot of that land. It's not clear that they're going to take advantage of higher land values to do new development, right? I mean, City Hall is where it is. They're not going to tear it down and replace it with condos and office buildings, right? So to a certain extent, the existing land use may limit the ability to do development around it, even if there's a need for it. And then I just wanted to highlight a couple of the differences across systems within an MSA. So San Francisco, of course, we have both Muni and BART. So the Muni system is closest to the East Coast transit systems, right? It's above ground streetcar, but these are old lines. They're very densely built, so the stations are close to one another. This is primarily close to the central business district. None of the Muni stations have parking, right? And the stations are sort of, the train just stops. It's not like you've got a big physical infrastructure you get on and off. And these are also primarily in commercial areas where you've got a lot of retail and office and so forth going on nearby, right? So that's sort of what we probably think about. But if you look at BART, which is, again, a fairly old system, these stations are 2.5 miles from the next station, right? So you get on one and you go a fair distance, right? But you're not going to transfer across these pretty easily. Farther from the CBD, 83% of the BART stations have parking, right? These are meant as park and ride commuter-oriented stations. LA, we have a similar kind of difference between the Metro Rail and the Metro Link. Metro Link is our suburban station, right? These are on average 12 miles from a CBD, and this includes all of the designated central cities, so it's not just downtown Los Angeles. 96% of these have parking attached to them. And you can see 43% of them were built in primarily industrial areas. So these really were going into areas that either there wasn't much activity there or they were kind of industrial spaces being repurposed. A lot of the Metrolink repurposed either freight rail or kind of older passenger rail from previous iterations of Amtrak and things like that.
Muni 1988? 1888?
So this is the Muni stations for which I could get opening dates. A lot of them I couldn't. And so for the purpose of my study, all I care is whether they were open before 1992. So any of the Muni stations that were already open before then, I think I assigned like 1985, just for the purpose of sort of splitting the before and after. But yeah, I mean, the Muni, a lot of these things have been around for 100 years or over 100 years.
Also, it's going to, for people in North San Francisco, it's going to freak them out. So you might only have
I should have an asterisk, yeah, exactly. It was surprisingly hard to get opening dates for the Muni stations, even the relatively recent ones, and the older ones, it was just sort of, if they were there, they were there.
For the parking commercial and industrial, is it like a mile radius, or what's the distance from the CBD station?
This is within a half mile of the station, but it's not super sensitive to definitions on that, yeah. Okay. So the empirical strategy for sort of the basic analysis, remember the question is there more retail activity after the stations open? So the dependent variable I'm going to look at is the density of retail employment, and I'll tell you the sort of the way I construct the areas here. So the number of retail employees per square mile to standardize across distances. My measures of station presence, so I have a dummy variable for whether there is ever going to be a station in the area. So it could have been built 100 years ago, it could be built halfway through my study period, there's ever a station in the area. There's another dummy for whether the station is new, meaning that it opens at some point after 1992. And that takes on the value of 1 for all of the new station areas, so distinguishes between the old and the new stations. And then the variable we're really going to be interested in is this post-station dummy. So for new stations, this takes on the value of 0 before the station opens and then switches over to 1 after the station goes into operation. For the older stations, this is always going to be the value of 1, and for control areas, this is always going to be 0. So the coefficient beta 3 is going to be what tells us whether employment increases around these new stations after they open. Then I have a bunch of control variables, which I'll show you a little bit in a moment, and dummies for fixed effects for the PUMA and year. So PUMAs are groups of contiguous census tracts that have a population of about 100,000. So these are sort of the larger market areas around the stations, which might pick up things like broader kinds of employment trends, crime rates, schools in the neighborhood, access to some of the things that I can't measure. And I know Jen does not like the PUMAs, so we can discuss if there are alternate measures that would capture the things I'm interested in. So the sort of key thing is to how to construct these treatment areas around the stations and then what serves as a reasonable control. And so I'll actually show you a picture of what I do. For each of the transit stations, this is in downtown LA, for each transit station I draw a quarter-mile circle around the station. This quarter-mile circle is the treatment area. It's sort of debated how broadly the spillovers are likely to be, anywhere from a quarter mile up to a half mile. I think that most of the activities should happen within a quarter mile because that's roughly how far most people are willing to walk from the station to get to stuff that's nearby. But given that the impact could go up to a half mile, I want to exclude this sort of outer circle, the quarter to half mile, I don't want to use that as a control area. So I draw another circle at the half mile boundary. The control areas are census tracts that don't overlap any of these half mile circles, but are in the same PUMA. So you can see here the census tracts that are gray, these are going to be my control area, my control areas, because they're never within a half mile of a rail station. The blue areas are going to be my treatment areas, and some of these, from this area, almost all of these are new stations, but the treatment area is designed the same for both the old stations and the new stations, right? And you can see for downtown LA, this is one of the densest areas of stations. So we actually have some of the quarter mile areas that overlap for a little bit. One of the reasons for picking a quarter mile and not a half mile is that there isn't a ton of overlap. The San Francisco Muni is the one place where this becomes problematic. But so this allows me to distinguish that the impact is essentially of a single station within the quarter mile area. Otherwise you get in sort of, if there are 3 or 4 stations overlapping, is there more impact? But that's not an issue for most of the stations we're going to look at. So treatment areas, quarter mile around the stations. So do this for both old and new control areas, these tracts that we think are outside of the treatment area. The employment data comes from the NETS, National Establishment Time Series. So a number of the faculty here have been working with this. A number of our graduate students are plowing into this as well. And for those of you who are interested in doing research on business dynamics or employment patterns, this is a really terrific data set because I have every business establishment in the state of California from 1992 to 2009. And I know the industry categories, so I can distinguish, for instance, retail and food service. But I have all of this in here. This is also how I constructed the measures of sort of these overall industrial, commercial, public, and institutional uses by looking at the types of jobs that are in the surrounding areas. All of the information on the transit stations was laboriously collected from the websites by my fabulous former RA, Marie Sullivan, who's now graduated and gone on to have an actual job at Metro. But she did really terrific GIS work and put together all of the station information on this. And then I have a bunch of different control variables, in particular for things like the economic and demographic characteristics of the neighborhood from the census and the ACS, and I'll show you some of the summary statistics on that. Again, trying to capture these ideas, sort of what was going on in the area before the station opened. Okay. All right. So kind of first question is, what were the neighborhoods like where we put stations, right? And thinking about, we've basically got 3 areas. We've got places that are never near a station, places that have had stations throughout my study period, and then station areas that received a station at some point, right? And the older stations, the older Muni stations, I don't know what that was like before it's been in there, but I can at least measure what it looked like in 1992 at the beginning of my study period. And then for the new station areas, I particularly want to know what did they look like, again, in 1992 before the station opened, and how different were they from the areas that never got stations, right? Were they selected to go into places that were either favorable for development or not? So I've highlighted just a couple of the characteristics here. Two of the things that matter the most for where retail goes is where there are jobs and where there are people living, right? So the density of employment and the density of population, because retail basically goes to where there are people who are likely to buy stuff, right? So from some of my prior research, this sort of density of total employment and density of population we think are going to be really important for determining future density. And if we look just across those two variables, so in 1992, both new stations and old stations had over 20,000 people per square mile working in the vicinity, right? So these are areas that have a lot of employment activity in 1992, which for the new stations is before they opened. The places that never get train stations have a much, much lower employment density, right? So this tells us already that there's some selection going on. They're putting the new stations in places that have a lot of activity going on. Population density, it's a little bit of a different story. So 1992 density around the old stations is definitely higher than around either the new or the none. But the difference between my new stations and my control areas is actually not statistically significant, right? There's not a huge difference between them, right? So a lot of jobs, but not a lot of people living nearby. David, did you have a?
Are you using 1992 as a baseline employment and then
Yes.
going up from it?
Yes.
Or did you try and, I'm just nervous about 1992 because it's the end of the recession in California, and particularly in LA, it's a big deal. And so I was wondering if you used more than 1 year or that's a concern I would have.
Okay.
Because in some sense, employment might grow simply because employment might grow rather than anything else. I mean, you have other things that you're controlling for it a little bit, but it still makes me nervous to have one base year rather than sort of an average of base years.
Yeah, so for the descriptive statistics, I'm using 92 because it's the earliest year for which I have employment data, and all of my new station opening is geared to or pre or post 1992. So I could, when I run the regressions, there isn't a base year. I've got year fixed effects in the model for all this, and actually your Puma fixed effects. So the comparison is not relative to 1992. The comparison is going to be relative to all of the years before the station opened. So for the regression results, it shouldn't matter, but I take your point that for the descriptive statistics, this may be a little misleading. Yeah. I'm sort of limited because if I use a later year, or sort of 92 through 94, I'm going to have to rejigger all of the stations, and I lose a bunch of the openings. But that would be worth checking to see if it matters. Yeah. Okay, so going into areas with different underlying employment and population density, if you look at the rest of these, sort of the older stations were really close to the CBD, newer stations are a little farther out, and the control areas are farther out still, which is not all that surprising. Some of these things, they're interestingly, the station areas have a lower average household income than the control areas. Sort of, you wonder, high-income areas like Beverly Hills don't really want to have train stations because then the rabble might come in, and so they may be more effective in pushing this out. The fact that these were not the highest income areas before the station opened suggests that there might have been room for growth. So this was not going into an area which was so high income or so high property value already that there isn't room for development and sort of mixture of other characteristics here. But pretty strong evidence, I think, that the stations were placed in locations non-randomly, and presumably the transit planners had a reason why they picked these areas and not the control areas. So just showing you some raw changes in employment. This is just for the newly opened stations. Average annual retail employment before the station opened and after the station opened. So this is with no controls. This is initially for all of the metro areas. So prior to station opening, the average was 2,000 employees per square mile. After the station opened, it goes up to about 2,700. So this is an increase of about 600 employees per square mile, which is a non-trivial number pre and post opening, right? So just first cut crosstab, this actually looks like retail employment grew. Then we break it out separately for our 4 major metro areas and discover that this is masking a number of different patterns. So for Los Angeles and Sacramento, we actually get a decrease in the employment density, right? This is just, no controls. This is just a level decrease in employment around the station areas after the stations opened, right? San Diego, there's an increase that's fairly small and not statistically significant. All of the impact is showing up in San Francisco, San Jose, right? So this goes from 2265 to almost 5,000 employees per square mile, right? So everything is happening in San Francisco. Other than that, we're really not seeing anything, right? Okay, now we put this in a regression framework and see whether this stuff still shows up. So the first column here is my dependent variable is natural log of retail employment per square mile, right? So employment density. First regression here is just the dummy variable for whether there is ever a station in the area, so telling us the difference between our treatment areas and control areas. And we get a positive and very significant effect, which is just telling us what the descriptive statistics did, that places that have stations at some point have a lot more employment than places that never get stations, right? So there's no controls. This does have the Puma-Ure fixed effects. Right. Next, we add in the dummy for the new station. So this tells us the difference between areas with older stations and newer stations. So the older stations had higher employment density than the newer stations did, but both of them have higher employment density than the control areas, right? Again, just what we saw from the descriptive statistics. Add in the post-station dummy, and very encouraging, we're getting a positive and significant impact. Employment density goes up around these new stations after they open. And then we add in controls for the sort of baseline neighborhood characteristics, and the effect becomes insignificant, right? So any increase in employment around the train stations seems to be due to the prior characteristics. In particular, these were places that already had a lot of people, that had a lot of jobs, that had various other neighborhood characteristics that made those places more likely to gain in retail employment, and the opening of the station actually didn't do anything. So this is splitting out the basic model by the 4 metropolitan areas, which again we think is going to give us some different answers, and indeed it does. Pretty much what we saw in the descriptive statistics, that in LA and Sacramento, you actually get a negative and significant impact. So after the station opens, retail employment densities are lower than they were before. San Diego, it's positive but not significant. And San Francisco, San Jose, it turns out once you put in the full set of controls, right, even that effect goes away, right? So there's no evidence at this point that there's a positive impact of stations opening. So I showed you all those pictures beforehand to suggest that there's heterogeneity in the stations, right? And these models control for the neighborhood characteristics, so we're picking up some of this stuff. But there's still a lot about the physical characteristics of the station, this difference between commuter rail versus the intra-city rail stations and so forth that we think might matter, right? So if I were to ask you, what types of stations do you think are more likely to have an impact to generate more retail growth? What would be your hypothesis? Which kinds of stations do you think would have the most impact? Inner city, okay, closer to the CBD. Other thoughts, other suggestions? Yeah?
Would it just be the amount of service? Because I'm sure like a metro station has like 2 trains a day.
Okay, so the number of trains coming, or possibly even the number of people who ride the station and who get on and off at the station. So courtesy of my former colleague, Peter Gordon, I now have some of the ridership data, which I haven't yet put into this model, but that's one to test in the future. I haven't done it yet. So what I have done is break this between stations that are within 5 miles of the central business district, so it's kind of central city versus the suburban stations. And then we know that the commuter rails run much less frequently, longer intervals in between. They don't run as late in the evenings. They don't run on the weekends. So it's sort of partly a proxy for the amount of ridership, and the number of trains nearby. I've split this to the commuter rails and the intra-city rail stations, right? So both the type of rail and then the location of the station. And the results are not at all what I expected, and not what you guys are very sensibly proposing. So the first set of these splits the stations within 5 miles of the CBD and more than 5 miles of the CBD. And what we're getting is actually opposite signs on these. So the stations that are within 5 miles of the CBD, the coefficient is negative and significant. So there's actually a decline in retail for the close, more centrally located stations. And there is a positive and significant impact for the ones that are farther away from the CBD. So our suburban stations are actually seeing more retail growth, and the central city ones are seeing a decline in retail employment, which is not at all what we would have expected. If we split this by intra-city, so this is the LA Metro trains versus Metrolink, and in the Bay Area, this is Muni versus BART. The ones that are intra-city also have a negative and significant. The commuter rail stations that go out to the suburbs have a positive and significant. Right? This is exactly counter what all of the sort of transit planners and urban planners would have thought. You should be getting growth in these kind of centrally located places where the trains run frequently, and on average you're going to have more people riding. And that's not at all what we're seeing. So the trend away from sort of small retailers on Main Street towards big suburban malls is actually much more than 20 years, right? That's been going on for 50, 60 years. I mean, I think, I tried to put myself in the mindset of a developer. If I were going to build a shopping center and I wanted to put it someplace where people are likely to go shop, are people interested in doing their kind of substantial shopping right next to train stations? Or do people want to drive their car to a mall in the suburbs and park in a space and go into IKEA and buy their giant bags of things and then go load them in the car and drive home? So I think that's probably part of what's going on, and particularly given that at least 3 of the cities in the sample, certainly LA, San Diego, and Sacramento, these are car-oriented cities, right? And people don't do their shopping. Even San Francisco, a lot of people own cars, and when they do their big shopping, they're going to go out to the malls, right? So, and there is a certain amount of evidence, I think some of the island-filled pieces on Atlanta suggest that the train stations that have parking adjacent have actually had more increase in property values and development, because having parking at the station enables people to come and use it. And even for developers who are going to do, if you think about some of the TOD projects in Pasadena, they've built apartments and they've done some ground floor retail, but they've got parking in those because people want to have cars anyway, right? And so the presence of parking and the proximity to this stuff actually makes it more useful. Right? To get a little bit of a sense of sort of whether these are reasonable numbers that we're getting from the coefficients, I did just some predicted magnitudes of the impacts. So the first row is just sort of the average retail employment. This is for all of the station areas and then the ones that are close in. So you can see that the average employment density of the close-in stations is much higher, right? So this is nearly 3 times as high. The close-in stations is the ones farther away from the CBD. So the question is then, what's the predicted change in employment, right? And you can see that density for the older stations, right, both is higher again for the ones close to the CBD than farther away. For the new stations that open, right, the ones that are close into the CBD, they're higher both before and after than the ones that are farther away, but there's a predicted decline, and that's what we actually see in the raw data for LA and San Diego for sure. And in the suburban stations, it's a much lower level, but a bigger increase, right? And so, again, this is still a fairly crude kind of division, close to 5 miles from the CBD, 5 miles away from it. So this is not picking up all of the details about the station characteristics, but this does suggest that there's something going on, that these centrally located stations are not attracting retail employment, right? So, main results, rail stations that went into California went into really different kinds of neighborhoods, and the stations look very different themselves. The neighborhoods that have both the older stations and the new rail stations are very different from the places that never got it. So there was significant planning about where they were supposed to go, and presumably some selection that we might want to worry about. Across the full sample, there's no significant relationship, right? We just don't get anything once we put the controls in there. There's no impact of stations on retail employment within a quarter miles of the station, but this association varies quite a bit across our metropolitan areas close to the CBD versus far away from the CBD, by rail system type, which I showed you, and which I didn't show you similar cuts, whether or not there was parking, and then the initial economic composition of the neighborhood, right? So there really isn't a single impact here. So what do we do with this? Clearly the new stations were not located at random. Particularly they had very high employment density prior to the station opening. And so the question is then, would the retail employment have increased in these areas in the absence of the station? To what extent could there have been displacement of activity with the station coming in? And in particular, why do we see this sort of odd pattern that the centrally located areas saw less growth, right? When we would sort of think that they were the most ripe for this. The one possibility is that maybe they were areas that already had a lot of retail activity, and so there just wasn't that much need, that much demand for new retail coming in. I think probably this question, do people actually want to go shopping by rail versus by cars, explains at least some of this. And we know that these suburban rail stations have parking adjacent, so even if you're doing TOD, you might be doing TOD nearby there, but they're still more accessible for this sort of retail activity. I think it's also quite possible that although there are higher land values close to the CBD, which might make development more attractive, these are also going to be areas that are very densely built. We're going to have to do some kind of a tear down in order to do new development and increase the density. These are places that are pretty highly regulated, that have strong political controls. It may just be hard to do development. There may also be business regulations that make it harder to open new business. So, in a sense, the suburban greenfields development is easier to do, and that's why developers go there in the first place. And so you just may not see that much activity in the central locations because it's harder to put in. Policy implications on this, I'm being a little bit cautious at this point, drawing too much, because I think there's still some more robustness checks to run. But I think it's pretty clear at this point that the impact of a train station on the surrounding neighborhood is not going to be the same for all neighborhoods, right? And so it's sort of a silver bullet to fix declining areas. I think we've got a lot of evidence to suggest that we can't rely on this happening. This is not consistently going to be an effective strategy for generating economic development, right? And that's been shown before on the residential side, and there's emerging evidence on the commercial side. Train stations don't necessarily generate jobs, they don't necessarily generate growth. Which sort of brings us back to what's the point of building all of this? The state of California spent a lot of money, LA metro area spent a lot of money building this. What are we hoping to get out of it? If the point is just to get people from place to place using existing patterns, you want to put your train stations where we have been putting them, which is in employment centers that are already there. And so you increase the ease of access between these existing population and employment centers, but it doesn't necessarily grow the areas around them. If the main purpose is in fact to spur economic activity, this begins to suggest that perhaps putting stuff in the suburbs is going to have a bigger impact, right? But if the idea is, do we want to encourage more development in Orange County or, along the Crenshaw line in South LA, this doesn't suggest that we're going to be able to stimulate a lot of job growth, right? And the blue line, I think, is a really good example, right? It's been here for 20 years. Nothing's really happened around it. That was supposed to revitalize a fairly distressed neighborhood, and that's, this is sort of the larger scale evidence of that. It just hasn't worked at doing that. Right? Which is not to say that Blue Line hasn't been successful. People who work in downtown Los Angeles and downtown Long Beach can get back and forth to their jobs, right? And has pretty heavy ridership, but it just hasn't generated business development or physical redevelopment of the area. Right? So that's it, and I'm happy to take whatever questions or comments you have. It takes a while for development to happen. On the other hand, they're already doing developments around the proposed stations in Santa Monica, and they're years away from having stations. So there's anticipation, the Blue Line for 20 years and nothing's happened. Given that this is a very large sample of stations, I think it's unlikely that adaptive reuse is explaining most of it. So downtown LA, that seems very plausible. I don't know if that's common in my other cities, my other station areas. So my guess is that's probably not sort of a systematic issue. But the time lags are definitely worth looking at. The policy, that is 100% right. So, the couple of stations where Metro really tried to do coordinated changes in the zoning, facilitate this, do ground leases with developers, the Hollywood and Highland, Hollywood and Vine. Metro owns the site, they brought in developers, they did concerted development around it, and those are places that look like what you'd expect. They didn't do that for most of the stations, right? And if you look at Arlington, Virginia, they upzoned dramatically around the stations and kept the zoning very low away from the stations, and they've got really high density, these peaks around every single one of the stations, and then single family neighborhoods, a half mile away. LA certainly LA has not done these sort of larger plans for it. One of my extensions to this, so I have a Haynes Foundation grant to do an LA specific piece of it, looking at both housing permits as well as the business development and trying to construct essentially a set of control tracks. So like if you think, the purple line goes down Wilshire, do this for, Santa Monica and Beverly, the parallel boulevards, and essentially look at these sort of large intersections as the control group, which I think is going to get around some of, the control tracks in here are not perfect controls. So I'm going to try to do that and look for the places that really have had growth, whether they changed the zoning at the same time. You know, did they do some sort of policy to make this work well? Because the coordination has to make this more feasible. And you know, if the expo line is all zoned R1 and they don't change it, you're not going to get development around it because you can't.
The stations are barren. There is nothing. You can't get a cup of coffee, you know, at the stations. You know, you can't get anything in the rail itself. The journey is 1 hour plus. So I'm wondering what kind of expectations are there for employment growth when we've had this over a span of maybe 15 years or more. I don't know the exact time when Metrolink started in that area. Not a single store, not a single you know, retail establishment. You know, what's your expectation?
Yeah, so you know, the Irvine station it's a big physical station, and inside it they have a little, you know, coffee kiosk, and you can buy a newspaper and a cup of coffee and, you know, some crackers, and that's about it. But you know, this is clearly owned and run by, I mean, you know, they presumably built it in and they lease it out to somebody, but they didn't plan for there to be a lot of retail activity nearby, and there isn't, you know, the possibility to do it. And it sort of seems obvious, like, you know, if they had just made this sort of a general commercial building with ground floor spaces, you can't tell me Dunkin' Donuts couldn't make money, you know, even if they ran it only like 5 days a week and during peak hours, that somebody could make money. So some of this is, you know, to David's question, if you don't build this stuff with commercial possibilities, then nothing can go in. You know, the Riverside line, I don't know, but I think you've got a lot of this. You know, on the other hand, if you build it in an area, I mean, this is sort of, you know, the absolute worst case example because, you know, Irvine, you know, all apologies, there's no sort of organic business going on there. You know, some of these others, I mean, if you look at, you know, best case scenario, something like Union Station, and you think about what's around it, you know, well, what kind of retail activity should want to go into an area that has a big bustling station that has lots of people coming and going? I mean, certainly the kind of things that serve commuters, but, you know, restaurants, this is a convenient place, you know, you've got, you know, you can have movie theaters. If you think about Hollywood and Vine, right, which is probably the most successful of the new stations here, I mean, they've done a ton of development. You've got movie theaters, you've got restaurants, you've got hotels, you've got clothing stores, you've got all kinds of activity nearby, right? So in the right locations, all sorts of retail should find this very attractive, right?
Right. Even at Union Station, I think the choices are so poor. I mean, I don't know if you've checked it out.
That's, yeah, I mean, some of this is,
It's a lot better than it used to be.
A
A
lot
lot better, yeah,
Yeah.
but it does, you know, I mean, it's
I mean,
just
within the station,
one
presumably
restaurant,
this
two
is an
tracks,
issue
that's
of, you know,
about it.
monopoly ownership. You know, does the station, I would assume that this is publicly owned space, does the station have an incentive to maximize profit, you know, by getting the best possible options in there? Probably not, but they've got some stuff in there that, you know, seems to work.
So in terms of an economic policy, if you were to label it properly, you call it a relocation strategy, right?
I don't know whether the businesses going into the successful areas are relocating from other places, so whether they're actually pulling away from other places or not. So what I'm looking at here is just the growth in net businesses. I actually could look at the relocations because I have that in the data, although my sense is that retailers don't relocate very much. So
Okay.
they open and they close, but they don't actually shut down in one place and move
Right.
somewhere
Okay,
else. One policy is not going to determine the rate of growth. You can make a lot of arguments that the city of LA is not a super friendly place to start a business. It's not a super friendly place to develop. There are all kinds of regulations that make it hard to do business here. I mean, you could say that about the state of California in general. The Bay Area certainly makes it hard to build things, hard to tear things down, hard to start up new businesses. So, you know, I think there are probably other forces at work, and, you know, tax rates, business regulations, zoning regulations are going on as well as the infrastructure development.
Right, but people keep saying we have a development policy. This is not a development.
This is not a development policy.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's all.
yeah.
Is there a ridership story here that is missing? Kind of, you know, how many riders are there on the line?
Yes.
Frequency, density.
Yes.
What time the stations are open?
So I do not
Makes a
have
huge
direct.
difference.
I do not have direct measures of ridership in here. I have that data, but I haven't cleaned it and merged it in and incorporated it. So that's one of the things that I will be able to do only for LA Metro. So I only have the ridership. So the next paper, which is the LA specific one, I'll have some other components, including ridership and including housing. You know, the proxies that I have here are things like the surrounding population density and employment density. You would expect there to be more people getting on and off stations in areas that have a lot of jobs and a lot of people living nearby. That said, some of the park and ride stations in the suburbs that have giant parking lots, there may be nobody living or working nearby, but a ton of people who drive in and park there. So what I have are at best proxies, and I don't know how good they are. But ask me in 6 months, and I can tell you some more.
This is a detail, but if you are going to focus in on Metro Rail, as far as food retail goes, you can't eat or drink anything on the train.
Which doesn't really stop people from eating and
Doesn't
drinking on the
stop people
train.
from doing it. I wish they would put in trash cans, but it's a policy issue that would affect, if you can't take your cup of coffee on the train with you, you're not going to buy one. It would affect the market or the demand for, at least for food retail or something else.
No, that's true. For stuff consumed on the train, I mean, again, the idea that you would, get off of the subway or get off of the train and, on your way into work, buy a cup of coffee or something, it would still be worthwhile to have it there. So what I have is the composition of employment within a half mile. So I've classified them as either predominantly commercial employment, which includes retail and offices and professional services, predominantly industrial, or predominantly public and institutional. And so I broke it out separate to those. And you actually get a bigger bump in retail in the areas that were initially industrial. And again, I think it's because there was nothing there, and so any increase in retail employment is an increase. Whereas the commercial areas and the public and institutional, the commercial areas had a lot already and didn't necessarily see growth. And the public and institutional, for various reasons like ownership and restrictions on the kinds of development and business activity, didn't see much either. Yeah.
Okay. Good presentation.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.